Big George, The Transformation of George Foreman. January 10, 1949. Marshall, Texas. In the Fifth Ward of Houston, where unpaved streets turned to mud with every rain and outhouses still served many families, Nancy Foreman held her newborn son and wondered how she would feed another mouth. George Edward Foreman entered the world in circumstances that offered little promise of the empire he would one day build. The Fifth Ward wasn't just poor. It was systematically deprived, a neighborhood where the American dream seemed like propaganda from another country. The houses were shotgun shacks with tin roofs that turned into ovens in the Texas summer and did little to stop the cold in winter. Running water was a luxury. Indoor plumbing was almost unheard of. Nancy Foreman worked whatever jobs she could find, cleaning houses, doing laundry, picking cotton when the season demanded it. She earned maybe $20 a week when work was available. George's biological father, Leary Moorhead, was not a steady presence. J.D. Foreman, who came into the family as a stepfather, also drifted in and out of the household while doing railroad construction work. By the time George was 7, there were 7 children in the Foreman household, all competing for limited food, limited space, limited everything. George would later recall the gnawing hunger that was his constant companion, the way you never quite forgot what it felt like to be truly hungry even decades after escaping poverty. The mathematics of survival were brutal and precise. 7 children, $20 a week when work was available. That meant less than $3 per child per week for food, clothing, shelter, and everything else. George learned to fight for his share, literally. At the dinner table, the fastest hands got the most food. In the neighborhood, the toughest kids got respect. By age 10, George Foreman was already showing signs of the size that would one day make him one of boxing's most feared punchers. He was bigger than other kids his age, stronger, and increasingly angry. The anger had no specific target. It was just there, simmering beneath the surface. A rage at the poverty, the hunger, the absence of a steady father figure, the helplessness of his situation. School held no interest. What was the point of learning to read when you were hungry? What did arithmetic matter when you couldn't afford to buy anything anyway? George became a truant, spending his days roaming the streets of Houston's Fifth Ward, looking for trouble or finding it looking for him. By age 15, George seemed destined for prison or death. He dropped out of school in 9th grade. Not dramatically, not with any grand gesture. He just stopped going, and nobody seemed to care enough to make him go back. His life became a series of petty crimes and street fights. He was good at fighting, naturally gifted with devastating power in his fists, but there was no art to it, no discipline. Just raw violence born of anger and desperation. By 16, George Foreman stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed over 200 pounds. He was intimidating just standing still, terrifying when angry. He had a reputation in the Fifth Ward as someone you didn't mess with, someone dangerous. The transformation began with a television commercial. In 1965, George was watching TV in a friend's house when he saw an advertisement for the Job Corps, President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program designed to help disadvantaged youth. The commercial promised job training, education, and a chance at a better life. Something about that commercial penetrated George's defenses. Maybe it was the promise of 3 meals a day. Maybe it was the chance to escape Houston. At age 16, George Foreman made the decision that would change his life. He joined the Job Corps. The program sent him to Grants Pass, Oregon. For George, who had never left Texas, who had barely left Houston's Fifth Ward, it might as well have been another planet. The Job Corps Center was set in mountains, surrounded by trees, with clean air and abundant food. The culture shock was profound and immediate. George had gone from a place where violence was currency to a structured environment with rules, expectations, and opportunities. He had gone from hunger to 3 guaranteed meals a day. He had gone from hopelessness to something he had never experienced before, possibility. At the Grants Pass Center, George was assigned to work in a carpentry program, but it was boxing that would truly transform him. The center had a boxing program run by Doc Broadus, a coach who saw potential in troubled young men that others missed. Broadus watched George in the gym one day, saw the size, the natural power, and the barely controlled rage that drove his punches. "You hit hard," Broadus told him, "but you're just swinging. You want to learn how to really box." Broadus took George's shrug as a yes and began teaching him the fundamentals. Boxing became the channel for George's rage. Instead of random violence on the streets, he could direct his anger into structured, sanctioned violence in the ring. Within 6 months, George Foreman was the Job Corps boxing champion. Within a year, he was competing in amateur tournaments across the West Coast and winning with devastating knockouts. The power that had made him dangerous on the streets was now being refined into a legitimate boxing skill. In 1967, Doc Broadus contacted the Northern California Boxing Association and told them about his prodigy. Within weeks, George was training at a legitimate boxing gym in Pleasanton, California, preparing for serious amateur competition. The transformation from street fighter to Olympic boxer took less than 3 years. George won the National AAU Heavyweight Championship, the Golden Gloves Heavyweight Championship, and earned a spot on the 1968 U.S. Olympic boxing team. He was 20 years old and had been boxing seriously for only 2.5 years. The 1968 Olympics in Mexico City took place against a backdrop of unprecedented social and political turmoil. The Vietnam War was tearing America apart. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy had shattered hopes for political change. Black athletes were planning protests. George dominated his Olympic opponents. He won his first match by knockout in the second round. His second match ended in another knockout. In the semifinals, he destroyed his opponent in the second round. The final was against Jonas Chepulais of the Soviet Union. The second round lasted 1 minute and 39 seconds. George came out aggressive, backing Chepulais into the ropes with his jab. Then he threw the right hand. It caught Chepulais flush on the chin and dropped him. The referee counted to 8. Chepulais rose, but he was clearly hurt. George moved in for the finish. Another right hand dropped him again. The referee waved it off. George Foreman was the Olympic heavyweight champion. What happened next would define George's public image for the next decade. As he stood in the ring, George grabbed a small American flag from someone at ringside. As the referee raised his hand in victory, George waved the American flag at the cameras. It was an instinctive gesture, not a political statement. George was proud to represent America. The Job Corps had given him a chance when he had none, but the gesture was immediately interpreted politically. 2 weeks earlier, Tommy Smith and John Carlos had raised their fists in a Black Power salute. Now here was George Foreman waving the American flag. The media made George a hero to many white Americans, but in parts of the black community, particularly among young activists, George's flag waving was seen by some as an Uncle Tom gesture, a betrayal. He received hate mail. People called him a sellout. George was confused and hurt by the response. He hadn't been trying to make a political statement. He had just been expressing genuine gratitude. But he learned a hard lesson. In America in 1968, everything was political, especially when it came to race. George signed with Dick Sadler, a veteran trainer and manager. Sadler would build George's career methodically, fighting frequently against progressively tougher opponents. George's professional debut came on June 23, 1969 in New York City. His opponent was Don Waldhelm. The fight lasted 3 rounds. George won by knockout. The pattern was established. George would fight every few weeks, always winning, usually by knockout. By the end of 1969, George had fought 8 times professionally, winning all 8 by knockout. Nobody had lasted past the 3rd round. In 1970, he fought 9 times, winning all 9 by knockout. In 1971, he fought 7 times, winning all 7 by knockout. The knockouts were becoming more brutal, more devastating. Against George Chuvalo in August 1970, George delivered a beating that made spectators uncomfortable. Chuvalo was known for his iron chin. He had never been knocked down in his career. George knocked him down 3 times in 3 rounds. The public perception of George Foreman in the early 1970s was of a surly, intimidating man who seemed angry at the world. He rarely smiled. He gave terse, uncomfortable interviews. He seemed to have no interest in being likable or marketable, but none of that mattered in the ring. George kept winning, kept demolishing opponents. By early 1972, he had a professional record that left no doubt about his power and momentum, and had become the mandatory challenger for Joe Frazier's heavyweight championship. The fight was set for January 22, 1973, in Kingston, Jamaica. Joe Frazier was at the peak of his powers. He had defeated Muhammad Ali in their first fight in March 1971, handing Ali his first professional loss. Frazier had successfully defended the title twice more. He was considered almost unbeatable, a relentless pressure fighter with devastating hooks and unbreakable will. George Foreman was a significant underdog. Frazier was 29-0 with 25 knockouts. The consensus among boxing experts was that George had power but lacked the experience and skill to beat Frazier. What happened over the next 6 minutes would shock the boxing world. The fight started with Frazier pressing forward, throwing hooks, trying to get inside George's reach. For about 30 seconds, it looked like the fight would follow the expected pattern. Then George hit him with an uppercut, thrown with shocking speed for such a big man. It caught Frazier coming in and lifted him off his feet. Joe Frazier, who had never been knocked down in his professional career until then, crashed to the canvas. Frazier got up quickly, almost embarrassed. 30 seconds later, George knocked him down again. Another crushing right hand sent Frazier sprawling. He got up again, but now there was something different in his eyes. Fear. George smelled blood. He came forward, throwing heavy punches. Another right hand sent Frazier down for the third time. In the second round, the demolition continued. George knocked Frazier down 3 more times. After the 6th knockdown, referee Arthur Mercante stopped the fight. George Foreman, at age 24, was the heavyweight champion of the world. The aftermath of the Frazier fight transformed George's life. He went from being a contender to being the most feared man in boxing. The way he had demolished Frazier, a fighter who had beaten Muhammad Ali, sent shockwaves through the sport. George's first title defense came on September 1, 1973, against Jose Roman in Tokyo. George knocked him out in the first round with a single right hand that left Roman unconscious on the canvas for several minutes. The second title defense was against Ken Norton, scheduled for March 26, 1974, in Caracas, Venezuela. George destroyed Norton even more brutally than he had destroyed Frazier. The fight lasted less than 2 rounds. George knocked Norton down 3 times. After the final knockdown, Norton's corner threw in the towel. But while George was dominating in the ring, his life outside it was becoming complicated. He had married Adrienne Calhoun in 1971, and they had their first daughter, Michai, in 1972. But the marriage was troubled. George was gone constantly, training, fighting, making public appearances. When he was home, he was often sullen and withdrawn. The anger that George channeled so effectively in the ring was spilling into his personal life. He had mood swings, periods of depression, explosive temper tantrums. The money and fame hadn't brought him happiness. The stage was set for the most famous fight in boxing history, George Foreman versus Muhammad Ali. The fight would be called the Rumble in the Jungle, held in Kinshasa, Zaire, on October 30, 1974. Muhammad Ali, at age 32, was considered past his prime. George Foreman, at age 25, was in his physical prime. He was undefeated at 40-0 with 37 knockouts. He was an 8-1 favorite. Most boxing experts predicted that George would knock Ali out, possibly in the first round. The fight was the brainchild of Don King, who convinced Mobutu Sese Seko, the dictator of Zaire, to put up $10 million to host the fight, $5 million for each fighter. The fighters arrived in Zaire in September. Ali immediately began his psychological warfare. He started calling George a mummy, suggesting he was stiff and slow. He told the Zairian people that George was an American puppet while Ali represented black pride. He chanted Ali Bame, Ali kill him, and got huge crowds to chant it with him. George didn't know how to respond. He took the bait every time, getting angry, making threats. Ali was winning the psychological battle before the fight even started. Then disaster struck. While sparring, George suffered a cut above his eye. The fight had to be postponed for 6 weeks. George stayed in Zaire training, waiting, getting increasingly frustrated and angry. Ali stayed too, continuing his psychological warfare, winning the hearts of the Zairian people. By fight night, George Foreman was a coiled spring of tension and rage. The 20th May Stadium in Kinshasa was packed with tens of thousands of people, almost all of them cheering for Ali. It was early morning local time. The atmosphere was electric. When the fighters entered the ring, the crowd chanted, "Ali Bame, Ali Bame." George looked around at the sea of hostile faces and felt something he had never experienced before in a boxing ring: doubt. The fight started as most predicted. George came forward, throwing heavy punches, trying to end the fight quickly, but Ali surprised everyone. Instead of dancing and moving as expected, he backed against the ropes and covered up, letting George punch him. Round after round, George threw massive hooks and uppercuts. Ali leaned back on the ropes, absorbing the punishment, occasionally firing back with quick combinations. Ali talked to George throughout. "Is that all you got, George? They told me you could hit." George kept punching, certain that eventually he would break through and knock Ali out. But the knockout never came. By the 5th round, George was getting tired. By the 7th round, his arms felt like lead. In the 8th round, Ali saw his opening. George threw a jab that Ali slipped. Ali then unleashed a combination that caught George flush on the jaw. George Foreman, who had never been knocked down as a professional until that night, went down. He fell face first on the canvas, tried to push himself up, got to one knee, but couldn't beat the count. Muhammad Ali had knocked out George Foreman to regain the heavyweight championship. The loss devastated George. It wasn't just that he had lost. It was how he had lost, knocked out by a man he had been certain he would destroy. In the months after the Ali fight, George fell into a deep depression. He barely trained. He gained weight. His marriage was falling apart. He spent money recklessly. Nothing worked. Dick Sadler convinced George that he needed to return to the ring. George agreed, but his heart wasn't in it. On January 24, 1976, George fought Ron Lyle in Las Vegas. It was a brutal fight. After being knocked down in the 4th round, George came back to knock Lyle out in the 5th. But the victory felt hollow. 5 months later, George fought Joe Frazier in a rematch. George won by knockout in the 5th round, but he took more punishment than in their first fight. He was slowing down. The final fight of what George would later call his first career came on March 17, 1977, against Jimmy Young in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Young was a slick defensive fighter. The fight went 12 rounds and George lost a unanimous decision. But something far more significant than a boxing loss occurred that night. After the fight, George was in his dressing room when he collapsed. He would later describe it as a near-death experience, a moment when he felt he was dying and had a profound religious vision. "I died and God brought me back," George would tell anyone who would listen. "Jesus Christ came into my life and saved me." In the days and weeks after the Young fight, George underwent a transformation as dramatic as any in sports history. He became a born-again Christian. He quit boxing immediately, announcing his retirement at age 28 while still one of the best heavyweights in the world. George returned to Houston and began preaching on street corners in the 5th Ward. People who knew him were stunned. This was George Foreman, the scowling, intimidating champion, now talking about Jesus and redemption. With the money he had left, George started the George Foreman Youth and Community Center in Houston. The center provided recreation, education, and counseling for at-risk youth. George also became an ordained Christian minister, eventually starting his own church. The transformation extended to his personal life. His marriage to Adrienne had ended. He later married Cynthia Lewis in 1977, and after that marriage ended, he married Andrea Skeet. His long marriage to Mary Joan Martley began in 1985 and lasted for decades. Mary Joan was deeply religious, grounded, and committed to the youth center and the church. Their marriage would produce 5 children together. The years from 1977 to 1987 were George's wilderness years in terms of boxing. He didn't fight at all. He focused entirely on his ministry, his youth center, and his family. He gained significant weight, going from the chiseled 220 pounds of his championship days to well over 300 pounds. But running a youth center and a church cost money, more money than George had. In 1987, George Foreman was 40 years old, financially strained and desperate. He needed money for the youth center, and there was only one way he knew to make significant money quickly. On March 9, 1987, George Foreman announced he was returning to boxing. The reaction ranged from amusement to horror. A 40-year-old former champion who weighed 300 pounds was going to fight again. Sports Illustrated put George on the cover with the headline, "Ready or Not." George's comeback fight was on March 9, 1987 against Steve Zowski in Sacramento, California. At weigh-in, George tipped the scales at 267 pounds, 40 pounds heavier than his championship fighting weight. But when the bell rang, something remarkable happened. George could still punch. Zowski lasted 4 rounds before George knocked him out. The boxing world was intrigued but not convinced. George kept fighting. He fought 5 times in 1987, continued to stay active through the late 1980s and early 1990s, and gradually climbed the rankings. But George's second career was different from his first. The angry, intimidating champion was gone. In his place was a smiling, jovial man who seemed to enjoy being in the ring. He joked with opponents during fights. He smiled at the crowd. He seemed to be having fun. This new George Foreman persona was partially genuine and partially strategic. George had learned that being likable sold tickets, but it also reflected a genuine change. The religious transformation had been real. George was happier, more at peace. The public responded. People who had disliked the young George Foreman loved the old George Foreman. He became a folk hero. George also showed remarkable marketing savvy. He started appearing on television shows, making jokes about his age and weight. He became known for eating hamburgers and talking about how much he loved food. By 1990, George had worked his way back into title contention. He was a top contender and was seeking another shot at the heavyweight crown. Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, Buster Douglas, and the shifting title scene changed the landscape, but George remained persistent. He fought Evander Holyfield on April 19, 1991, at the Atlantic City Convention Center and lost a competitive unanimous decision. George was 42 years old. Time was running out, but he kept fighting, taking many fights through the early 1990s to stay sharp and remain in the public eye. During this period, George's life outside boxing was thriving. The youth center was doing well. His marriage to Mary Joan was strong. Their family continued to grow. They would eventually have several children together, and he remained closely involved with children from previous relationships. George had an unusual relationship with his sons. He named 5 of his sons George, George Jr., George III, George IV, George V, and George VI, explaining that he wanted them all to have something he never had, a father they could be proud of. In 1994, Sultan Inc., a small appliance company, approached George about endorsing a new product, an indoor grill that reduced fat and meat. The George Foreman grill seemed like a perfect fit. George loved food, talked about food constantly, and had a warm, trustworthy personality. The grill was introduced in 1994 and became an immediate sensation. It sold tens of millions of units worldwide, making it one of the most successful small appliances in history. Foreman negotiated for a percentage of sales rather than a flat fee, a decision that would make him far more money than he had earned in boxing alone. In 1999, Sultan purchased Foreman's interest in future royalties for a reported sum, commonly reported as about $138 million, a deal that transformed his financial security. But in 1994, George was still chasing the heavyweight title. He was 45 years old and had been fighting professionally for 6 years in his comeback. Michael Moorer, a southpaw who had moved up from light heavyweight, held the WBA and IBF titles at the time. Moorer was a skilled boxer with a good jab and solid power. The fight was scheduled for November 5, 1994, at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. George weighed in around 250 pounds. Moorer weighed about 222 pounds. George's trainer, Gil Clancy, had a simple strategy: survive the early rounds when Moorer would be fastest, then try to land the big right hand late when Moorer might be tired. The fight went as planned for much of the night. Moorer boxed well and led on the cards. But in the 10th round, George landed a devastating right hand that knocked Moorer out. George Foreman, at age 45, had knocked out Michael Moorer to become the heavyweight champion of the world, 20 years after losing the title to Muhammad Ali. He was the oldest heavyweight champion in history. The victory made George a global icon. George defended the title briefly, and then vacated belts rather than face certain mandatory challengers. His second retirement came in 1997 after a long and storied career, although he had effectively finished the boxing chapter of his life after regaining the title in 1994 and defending it intermittently. His final professional record is widely reported as 76 wins, 5 losses, with a large majority of those wins coming by knockout. The George Foreman grill continued to be phenomenally successful. Combined with savvy investments and later deals surrounding the grill, Foreman amassed substantial wealth. He invested in businesses and real estate and made sure his family and charitable projects were taken care of. The youth center he started continued to grow and serve young people in Houston. George also continued his ministry, preaching and speaking about his faith. He wrote books about his life and his faith and appeared on television as a boxing commentator and motivational speaker. He became an elder statesman of boxing, a beloved figure whose story of redemption resonated across generations. His relationship with Muhammad Ali evolved with time. Years after their fight in Zaire, George often spoke of Ali's genius and later paid tribute when Ali's health declined, and after Ali's death in 2016. The family George built became a source of immense pride. The exact number of his children is large. He has many children and grandchildren, and 5 of his sons bear his name. His relationship with Mary Joan remained a cornerstone of his later life. The George Foreman grill's success and his charitable work ensured his legacy beyond the ring. The story of George Foreman is ultimately about transformation and redemption. It showed that people could change, that pasts didn't have to determine futures, that it was never too late. From angry street kid to Olympic champion to intimidating heavyweight king to born-again preacher to beloved comeback story to successful businessman to charitable elder statesman, each phase represented a different version of George Foreman, yet all were authentically him. The poverty of his childhood never left him, not really. Even after earning substantial wealth, George remembered what it felt like to be hungry. That memory drove him to help others, to ensure his own children never experienced such desperation. The anger that had fueled his young career had been real and dangerous, but boxing gave him an outlet, the Job Corps gave him a chance, and his eventual spiritual transformation gave him peace. The loss to Ali, which seemed like the end of everything in 1974, turned out to be crucial. It humbled him, forced him to confront himself, and ultimately led to the spiritual experience that changed his life. The comeback itself defied every conventional wisdom about aging athletes. George fought competitively into his mid-40s and won the heavyweight championship at an age when most fighters were long retired. The business success, particularly with the grill, showed that athletes didn't have to be defined solely by their playing careers. The charitable work, especially the youth center, gave George's life meaning beyond personal achievement. Helping at-risk youth escape the poverty and violence he had experienced became his greatest passion. The family he built provided George with the stability and love he had never known as a child. As George Foreman moved through his later years, his place in American cultural history was secure. He was more than a boxer, more than a businessman, more than a minister. He was a symbol to many of resilience, second acts, and reinvention. The boy born in Marshall, Texas, in 1949 had traveled an incredible journey, from the Fifth Ward's unpaved streets to Olympic glory in Mexico City, from the championship throne to spiritual awakening, from comeback fighter to unlikely champion at 45, from boxer to businessman to minister to icon. George Foreman had been knocked down many times. Each time he had gotten back up. Each setback had become the setup for the next comeback. Each failure had taught lessons that enabled future success. As he entered the final phases of his life, George remained grateful for everything he had experienced and achieved. The poverty had taught him empathy. The anger had given him strength. The boxing had provided opportunity. The loss to Ali had humbled him. The spiritual transformation had given him peace. The comeback had proved his resilience. The business success had provided security. The charitable work had given him purpose. It was a complete life, a full life, a life that had mattered.